Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of sectionalism in the years leading up to the Civil War. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the evolution of the political parties in the 1850s and the situation in Kansas that came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. After the furor over the Fugitive Slave Act had died down somewhat in the early 1850s, a group sometimes known as Young America held sway in American politics for a brief period. The man who was elected president in 1852, Franklin Pierce, represented this movement, which was characterized by a powerful nationalist vision of territorial expansion, increased international trade, and the spread of American ideas abroad. Franklin Pierce was elected on an aggressively expansionist platform. But in practice, many of his plans ran afoul of the sectional politics of the day. For instance, when Pierce entertained thoughts of annexing Hawaii or Alaska, Southerners rejected those ideas because it might mean adding additional free states. Similarly, Northerners rejected any thought of annexing Cuba, as evidenced by the 1854 Ostend Manifesto, which was a private exchange between Franklin Pierce and one of his foreign secretaries that he would consider taking Cuba from Spain by force. Pierce justified this by saying that by every law, human and divine, we would be justified in seizing Cuba. When word of this report got out, Northerners were incensed. And so again, this represents the idea that the Young America platform of expansion was really difficult to move forward in this age of questions of the expansion of slavery. Another member of this Young America movement was Stephen Douglas of Illinois, and he became a central figure in one of the most controversial acts of this era, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the crisis that followed it. So by 1854, a sectional rivalry was brewing yet again, this time over the dispute over a possible transcontinental railroad. And there were a number of different possible routes being proposed for this potential transcontinental railroad, the most popular one proposing its terminus in Chicago and running along a northern route, but other proposals, such as one ending in New Orleans and running along a southern route, were proposed at that time. So Stephen Douglas of Illinois obviously is one of the bigger proponents of the northern route, Chicago being in Illinois and the promise of great wealth, of course, coming from this railroad. And so in keeping with his Young America progressive ideals, Stephen Douglas wanted to get the northern route of the railroad approved as quickly as possible. One hurdle to that was that much of the railroad line, as it was proposed, would run through unorganized territory. And so Douglas proposed to organize the territory as soon as possible. This was territory known as the Nebraska Territory. And so Douglas proposed that the Nebraska Territory be divided into two states, and that those states would determine for themselves whether to be free or to be slave. His thinking, in part, was that the southern of the two territories, which would become Kansas, was more likely to become slave. The northern part, Nebraska, would certainly be free, and therefore the balance in Congress could be maintained. Using his considerable political skills, Douglas was able to get the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act forced through Congress. And if we look at a map of what this looked like at that time, the territory here becomes known as the Kansas Territory. This is the Nebraska Territory, which obviously would later on be divided into even more states. But the idea being that the Kansas Territory might enter as a slave state. Now, one result of this, which we need to be aware of, is that the old Missouri Compromise line, which ran along roughly this parallel, was overturned by the Kansas-Nebraska Act because obviously Kansas was north of that line. Once the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, Kansas became a major issue in America the following year, 1855. Settlers from both North and South moved into Kansas, and many crossed the border from Missouri, which remember is slave territory, into Kansas to try to influence the voting there, whether Kansas would be slave or be free. There were a number of early votes, many of which were disputed because of so many people crossing over from Missouri, and which also resulted in a government favoring slavery in Kansas. The anti-slavery group in Kansas formed its own government, and for several years Kansas functioned under two governments, one slave and one free. Bad blood ran very deep between the two sides, and there was much fighting between them. It was a miniature civil war in some ways, now known as Bleeding Kansas. The battle in Kansas was something of a holy war, inspiring deep passions on both sides. In one case, an Alabama man sold his slaves to raise money and hire an army of 300 men to fight for slavery in Kansas. At Yale University, the noted minister Henry Ward Beecher, who was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, presented 25 Bibles and 25 rifles to young men to go fight for the Lord in Kansas. The New York Tribune wrote, "We are two peoples. We are a people for freedom and a people for slavery. Between the two, conflict is inevitable." Indeed, Bleeding Kansas marks the first significant bloodshed in the sectional conflict between North and South, and some scholars view this as the first shot of the Civil War itself. As the sectional conflict grew more intense in the country, political parties fell into alignment more or less along sectional lines. Whatever other issues the parties had embraced, the issue of slavery became front and center as the parties realigned in the 1850s. On the one hand, the new Republican Party, established essentially after the 1854 congressional elections, was essentially united over the issue of opposition to slavery, and certainly any further concession regarding the expansion of slavery into territories. On the other hand, the Democratic Party became largely a Southern party, but certainly based around those who supported slavery. There was in the 1850s, though, another issue that many people got behind, and that was the issue of immigration. I talked in previous lectures about the growing numbers of immigrants coming into the country in the 1840s and 50s, primarily Irish and Germans, many of whom were poor, unskilled Catholics. With that influx of immigration rose another party called the American Party, which was also nicknamed the Know-Nothing Party, because their meetings were typically held in secret, and if anyone asked, members were required to respond, "I know nothing," when asked about this party. The Know-Nothings rallied behind a single cause, the idea of nativism, or the thought that native-born Americans were superior to foreign-born immigrants. And their platform was based on limiting and even eliminating the immigration of foreigners who in their view, took American jobs and were associated with social ills like alcoholism and crime. The Know-Nothings reached the peak of their power and influence after the 1854 elections, when they sent about 75 congressmen to Washington and gained control of a number of state legislatures. But their popularity faded relatively quickly in the aftermath of those elections because the issue of slavery became such an overwhelming one that even the matter of immigration paled in comparison. And so by 1856, national attention had returned again to the issue of slavery and its expansion into the new territories and states, primarily Bleeding Kansas, which we talked about previously. Members of Congress needed to know which government in Kansas was legitimate and how were we going to recognize issues coming out of Kansas. And so there were a number of powerful speeches delivered in both houses of Congress during that time. One of them led to one of the most notorious episodes of this era, the so-called BrooksSumner Affair in May of 1856, when Charles Sumner, an esteemed senator from Massachusetts, who becomes very important in the period after the Civil War, in the Reconstruction years, delivered a fiery speech called The Crime Against Kansas, or The Rape of Kansas, in the Senate, in which he made some very pointed references to a number of Southern congressmen. The nephew of one of those congressmen, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, did what any good Southerner would do. He defended his honor. He sought out Sumner on the floor of the Senate and beat him nearly to death with a cane. It would be 4 years until Charles Sumner would return to the Senate, during which time they left his seat and desk open, awaiting his return. Imagine a representative beating a senator on the floor of the Senate with a cane. But these are the kind of things that happened in this era. To Southerners, Preston Brooks became a hero of the age, and he received dozens of canes in the mail sent by his many fans across the South. The beating had some unanticipated consequences. You see, out in Kansas, an anti-slavery zealot named John Brown heard the news of the caning and flew into a rage. At that time, Brown was a 56-year-old, deeply religious man. He was an Old Testament Christian, believing in eye for an eye justice. Brown had happened upon Kansas after a life of hit-and-miss business ventures and farming efforts, and found there a perfect outlet for his rabid abolitionism. With 6 of his 20 children, he signed up for a Free State military company and took to fighting the war against slavery. After hearing about the BrooksSumner Affair, Brown declared, "Something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights." Brown reckoned that the pro-slavery forces in Kansas had killed at least 5 Free Soilers. So as retribution, on the night of May 24th, he and his sons abducted 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins and split open their skulls with a broadsword. An eye for an eye. Brown was never arrested for this crime. Federal soldiers in the area were too concerned with other matters to pursue him much. And before long, Brown and his family had faded back into anonymity. But they would resurface again on the eve of the Civil War in another of the most notorious episodes of this